Let's talk about some of the best practices that are associated with exception handling in Java. So the first one that I have here is to catch as specific of an exception that you can. So what I mean by this is you shouldn't try to avoid catching exception or error or even runtime exception. The reason for this is because you will end up catching a lot more than you might bargain it for. And really, in cases where you are catching a generic exception, it's very unlikely that you are going to be able to do anything really useful. And there are of course a few exceptions to this rule or this guideline when you are trying to just log something and you don't know what it is, or maybe it's a catch-all for if you have tried to catch some specific exceptions, but you have this other exception that might have existed and you need to do something and you need to log it. But in general, you want to be as specific as possible, because the more specific of an exception that you catch, the more likely that you are going to be able to do something good or do something beneficial with that exception when you catch it. And also, you are not going to take away that exception. It really is bad when you just catch the general exception and you end up catching exceptions that may be somewhere else in the code or higher up the code stack someone could have done something with, something meaningful, and you are caught that exception because you had made your exception handling too wide. The next best practice, this one is somewhat debatable, actually is exceptions are for exceptional situations only, and I kind of lean on both sides of the fence. I kind of straddle the fence on this one. It kind of depends. This is really a difficult topic and there is some good arguments on either side. I tend to probably lean more on the exceptional situations, but there are certain times in the code where I think it does make sense to use exceptions for what some people might say is flow control of your program. And I don't use that lightly. You definitely shouldn't use exceptions in general for flow control. It's not a way to get out of a loop. It's not a way to jump around in your code. But if you have some logic and you have an error condition, even an error condition that you could have detected, sometimes it makes sense to use an exception there. A lot of programmers would say never use exceptions except it's something that you couldn't have checked without an exception. Something that, like reading a file and that file doesn't exist, and let it throw that exception. In fact, they might even say, well, check to see the file, to see if the file exists, and avoid throwing the exception or handling the exception. But in general, this concept or this best practice is based on this idea that you really shouldn't just be using exceptions everywhere. You shouldn't be just throwing exceptions in order to change the flow of your program. Exceptions are really for error conditions. If you kind of follow that spirit of using exceptions, you are going to have a lot less of exceptions littering through your code, and really your code is going to be a little bit more performant, because using exceptions is not the most efficient way to, for example, exit loops or jump around in your code. Another important best practice, we would kind of mention this before. This one is specific to Java, which is do not catch errors. We saw how there is the unchecked exception that inherits from error, and everything that inherits from error there, and any exceptions in that class you really shouldn't be catching, because those are critical things that you might not be able to even guarantee that you could do anything with. So I will give you a good example here, which is out of memory exception. If you get an out of memory exception and you catch that, what are you going to do with it? You are out of memory. You can't guarantee that you are going to be able to do anything with it. So it's really going to give you kind of a false sense of security, and it might even cause more problems. If you are low on memory and you are getting the out of memory error and then you try to do something, you might really cause a big problem, whereas the program could have just crashed it and dumped a stack trace, and you could have figured out that you are out of memory. But if you try to do something, you might make it even more confusing. So in general, you shouldn't be trying to catch errors. It's really unexpected that someone would put a catch block in that catches errors, and because of that, if you do that, you could end up having code that is really confusing to someone because they are thinking, where did this error go? I didn't expect anyone to actually catch this. And then this one is really important. This is kind of near and dear to my heart as far as best practices for exceptions in all languages, especially Java, is don't just catch an exception that you are not going to be able to do something with. It's the way that we call this is eating an exception. And every time I see this in code, I cringe because this is really bad. And what this means is a lot of times you will see this where someone just puts catch exception, and then inside of that catch block they don't do anything with it and they just eat the exception. And that's really bad because one, you don't know what has happened with your code. Some bad thing has happened, and if you put that in there, you are not going to find out. It's just going to go on its way. It's like exceptions don't exist. An exception happened because there is an error, and so if you are going to catch an exception, you need to make sure that you are going to be able to do something with that exception and not just eat it. And the other reason for this is because if you eat the exception, you are basically stealing lunch from someone else. Maybe someone else could handle that exception and do something. But because you have ate the exception, that exception is gone. And the code that could have actually handled it will never know that that exception was thrown.